So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural session, to the inaugural lecture of this distinguished lecture series that the Association of Indian Hispanists has launched. And as many of you know, this lecture series has been conceived of as a forum for inviting speakers with exceptional records of publication and research activity on language, literature, culture, philosophy, and on the history of ideas in the context of Latin America and Spain. And we have also promised these lectures to be as much as possible in English also, in order that we move out of the restrictive definition of Hispanists. And I'm extremely happy to see many of our friends from the comparative literature and cultural studies and English studies here in the amongst the people who are participating. To begin with, I would like to profoundly thank our two speakers for today, Professor Carlos Jáuregui and Professor David Solodkow. We are really grateful. We are absolutely so very happy that we are able to launch this series with somebody who has got the kind of rigor, the academic rigor that your work has. Um, we are particularly happy to have you because the decolonial thought from Latin America has had a rich harvest in India. You know, so the decolonial and the post-colonial are often read together in contrast, in comparison. But as we all know, the decolonial term of theoretical and political positions. And so while you have some like Walter Mignolo, who's very well known in the Indian academia, somebody like Mignolo would privilege difference and interpret the decolonial option as a project of demodernization and epistemic delinking from Western thought. Authors of this book that we are going to hear about today, both the professors, the authors of the book on Bartolomé de las Casas and the biopolitical paradigm of colonial modernity, have clearly, as the title shows, opted for the actually work on the what they have termed in their introductory chapters as the biopolitical turn in Latin American cultural studies, which, as they mention in their book, after these 2 decades of identity-based or difference-based cultural criticism, is now, it's refreshing actually to see that it is historically grounded in the material realities of the worlds that we inhabit. And uh, I, uh, I think that today's session is going to be enlightening to many of us in many ways. We have always looked at Las Casas as a Christian humanist, of course, trapped in the blindness to any notion of the Indian as a subject, and of course, and is also trapped in his belief of the universalist nature of Christianity. But moving beyond that and looking at Las Casas as a thinker of the early phase or the early mercantile phase of capitalism, as you have kind of posited him, I think it's going to be a very new way of looking at Las Casas. The session for today will be moderated by Professor Vijaya Venkatraman, who's also the Vice President of the Association of Indian Hispanists. Professor Venkatraman, or Vijaya, or Viji as we lovingly call her, is a professor of Hispanic Studies she's currently also the head of the Department of Germanic and Romance Studies in the University of Delhi, a huge university. The department itself is big, huge, with thousands of students learning different languages. And her research has her research interests actually vary, but have basically centered on the Latin American testimonio, detective fiction by female writers. But more importantly, I think now she's more and more working on Cervantine themes in 21st century Latin American literature. She's in fact a vocal, that is an executive committee member of the International Association of Cervantistas. So with this, I again warmly welcome you, Professor Jáuregui and Professor Solodkow, thank you so much. And I hand over the session to Viji. Viji, over to you.
Thank you, Sonia. And I can see that more people have joined as we have started. And as Sonia has already suggested, this presentation is going to be very interesting because it brings into discussion a new facet of Bartolomé de las Casas, whom we have always seen, as Sonia said, as a humanist and embedded in the universal ideas of Christianity. And first, let me warmly welcome Professor Carlos Jáuregui and Professor David Solodkow, and thank them also for accepting to give this talk today and to be part of our distinguished lecture series of the Association of Indian Hispanics, which is a new entity which is just about taking its first steps. And we hope that with this talk, we will be able to reach across to a lot of Indians across the country and attract them to this forum for discussion. So let me begin by introducing our speakers for today. Professor Carlos Jáuregui is Professor of Cultural Studies and Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame and distinguished member of the Emiliano Zapata Salazar Cátedra and a Fulbright Garcia Robles Scholar at the UNAM. He is the author of the book which we are discussing today, Bartolomé de las Casas y el Paradigma Biopolítico de la Modernidad Colonial, along with the other speaker. And other books that he has written are Espectros y Conjuras in 2022 and Canibalia in 2028, which also won the Casa de las Americas Award. His other works include Theatre of Conquest, 2008, and he co-edited Emiliano Zapata 100 Cien Años, Cien Fotos, and which also got the Dolores Huerta Book Award. Of Rage and Redemption, again in 2008, and Coloniality at Large with Enrique Dussel and Mabel Morania, published by Duke again in 2008. Professor David Solodkow is a professor of Latin American literature at the Universidad de los Andes, Colombia. And he's also the author of this book, which we are discussing, which they will be presenting today, and which we will have the opportunity to discuss at length. And also a book called Mestizaje Inconcluso in 2022, Ficción Biopolítica y Eugenesia en el Martín Fierro in 2014, and Etnógrafos Coloniales in 2014 again. He has also co-edited along with Professor Carlos Jáuregui, Emiliano Zapata, Cien Años, Cien Fotos, and Sujetos Múltiples, 2014, Perspectivas sobre el Renacimiento y el Barroco in 2011, Poéticas de lo Criollo in 2009. And his work centers on biopolitics, colonialism, and violence in Latin America. Today, that we are going to discuss is a book which was published in 2024, which is entitled Bartolomé de las Casas and the Biopolitical Paradigm of Colonial Modernity, which examines the concept of colonial biopolitics and introduces the central idea of Las Casas as with ideas with the emergence of colonial biopolitics. The book actually explores the early writings of Las Casas through the lens of colonial biopolitics, analyzing his proposals which to sustain and govern indigenous life as an object of political economy amid the catastrophic depopulation of La Española and the Greater Antilles. While traditionally seen as utopian and humanitarian, Las Casas, but his interventions reveal the emergence of a modern political concern with population management, ultimately caught in the contradiction of preserving life while subjecting it to colonial exploitation. So without further ado, I invite the speakers Professor Carlos Jáuregui and Professor David Solodkow to begin their presentation. And I leave it to them to decide which one of them would start and how it would proceed. And after the talk, we will open the session to questions and discussions and comments, and to which the speakers can then respond.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. We
Yes.
would like to thank all of you, professors, and the Association of Indian Hispanists for their kind invitation, and all of you for coming today or tonight in India. Indeed, we are going to talk a very strange Bartolomé Las Casas, who is not a friar yet. We are talking about the period between 1515 and 1521, 22, which is a period that is not very well known in Las Casas studies. We can think of Bartolomé Las Casas as his work and his thought as divided by the period in which he entered the convent, the Dominican convent in La Española, which is the period between 1522 and 1531-32. After that year, after 32, Las Casas returned. You know, if we were to do a movie, would be Las Casas Return, second part, in which he come as the Las Casas that we all know, right? The one who is going to advocate for peaceful conversion, who is going to participate in a debate about the treatment of the indigenous people in the Americas, who is going to write La brevísima relación de la destrucción de las Indias, a treatise on the subject of the sovereignty of the kings in Spain, in America. So all these Las Casas that became sort of a saint thanks to nationalist historiography in the 19th and 20th century. But this is a different Las Casas. Las Casas is not a friar. He was an encomendero. He participated in the wars of pacification of indigenous people in La Española. That's why he was an encomendero. He received some Indians as an award for his service in the war. He also participated in the conquest of Cuba, and he's sort of having a change of heart. And that change of heart is not a humanistic or a revelation of some sort of epiphany, spiritual epiphany, but it's the direct result of an economic situation. And that's basically the presentation. We are going to present two examples of the argument in the book. The first referred to the communities that he designed, some of the utopian communities he designed for La Española. And the second part would be about the hospital and public health. Those are the two examples that we are going to mention. I'm hoping that you will see the presentation now. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. This is a presentation that is in memoriam of Klaus Berber, a very important publisher who has published some of our books and somebody we miss a lot. Using biopolitics in a colonial context may seem odd or anachronistic. Foucault coined the term to describe how the modern state intervenes in and manages biological life of the population it governs. In the late 18th century, Foucault says, a new form of power emerged, shifting from the sovereign right to take life or let live to a new power to make live and let die. This power fosters and manages some forms of life while abandoning or even eliminating others, a logic later called necropolitics by Achille Mbembe. This modern state no longer governs individuals, but population as a whole. This is a new form of governance. But we argue that the power to make live, and specifically not to let die, began as a political idea much earlier during the conquest of America, if not before, and was articulated in Las Casas' early writings. Biopolitical analysis has largely ignored the specific forms of domination and colonial rule that followed the so-called discovery of America, when entire human groups were seen, classified, and governed as human flocks, subjected to mass conversion, displaced across regions and continents, racialized, reduced, and confined in order to be more easily controlled and exploited. The administration of these populations led to the developments of distinct models of governmentality marked by intense systems of measurement, evaluation, regulation, and control. These colonial strategies for managing life and extracting labor were not merely precursors to modern biopolitics. They were in themselves fully biopolitical. This is a topic and argument of our book. Between 1504 and 1514, gold shipments or remesas from Española to Spain peaked due to Governor Nicolás de Obando organization of gold mining through the forced labor system known as encomienda, repartimiento en encomienda. However, after 1514, gold revenues declined sharply, never to recover again. This decline in gold was directly tied to a demographic collapse. The indigenous population fell from about 340,000 in 1492 to just 12,000 by 1516 due to war, famine, forced labor, and disease. Attempts to replace the dying population by importing natives from other islands, Bahamas particularly, between 1510 and 1514 slightly slowed the decline, but by 1519, indigenous population was reduced to about 4,000 individuals. The Dominican order had been denouncing forced labor as the main cause of indigenous mortality since 1510. In 1511, Anton Montesinos delivered his famous sermon in La Española, publicly condemning the exploitation of indigenous people. This supposedly led to the promulgation of the Laws of Burgos, 1512, 1513, the first legal framework regulating indigenous labor in the Americas. This sequence has traditionally been interpreted as the birth of Christian humanitarianism and the origin of human rights. However, we argue that these responses were biopolitical. Specifically, the Laws of Burgos were not the result of a moral awakening following Montesinos' sermon, as is often claimed, but rather the outcome of a political and economic imperative to keep indigenous workers alive, making the laws biopolitical. Now, the laws were ineffective, but still biopolitical. In 1512, Fray Pedro de Córdoba traveled to Spain to defend Montesinos and the Dominican order at court. And then he encountered the newly issued Laws of Burgos, and he was appalled. He condemned them as unjust, arguing that the laws treated the Indians as livestock, ganado, and kept the repartimiento system, which was a legal and economic tool of cruel exploitation. In 1513, the king appointed a commission to revise the laws, but the reforms didn't satisfy the Dominicans. In 1515, Las Casas and Montesinos returned to Spain to warn King Fernando about the worsening of the population and the failure of the reform. The king, gravely ill, called for a second meeting with Las Casas, but died before it happened. Las Casas then planned to travel to Flanders to meet the young Charles I. Before doing so, he stopped in Madrid and delivered his first formal memorial to the regents, Cardenal Cisnero and Adriano de Utrecht, a heated denunciation of the destruction caused by forced labor and neglect of the indigenous health. We don't have a copy of this memorial, of this first memorial, just a summary of it. The cardinal told Las Casas that it was not practical to go to Flanders and instead arranged a meeting with jurist Juan López de Palacio Rubios. Yes, Palacio Rubios, the same author of the Requerimiento, the document read to the indigenous people before conquest, which compelled them to accept the sovereignty of the Spain crown or face war and dispossession. According to Las Casas, Palacio Rubio approved his memorial, improved it, and rewrote it in the style of court. So this is a co-authorship, this memorial. The 1516 Memorial de Remedios by Bartolomé Las Casas and Palacio Rubios made various recommendations to the Spanish crown to remedy this crisis, a series of biopolitical policies for saving, multiplying, governing, and peacefully exploiting the Indians in Española, Cuba, Jamaica, and San Juan. Among these remedies, we have the suspension or suspending forced labor, prohibiting the displacement of indigenous people from one island to another, rescuing at-risk populations or groups and relocating them to refugee camps. He has the first proposals of a refugee camps in colonial modernity, promoting the recovery and fattening of the decimated population, ensuring a nutritious diet, encouraging mestizaje, reducing child mortality, modifying harmful eating and clothing habits, restoring physical health through medical care, and David is going to talk about that, and the most important remedy, organizing utopian agrarian and mining communities under special jurisdiction with the strict regulations of labor and rest. Las Casas believed the main cause of suffering was the forced use of indigenous labor under the repartimiento, which he called a political, economic, and moral plague. This system had been made legal by Governor Nicolás de Obando between 1503 and 1515 to increase the mining profits. So this is the organization of the mining. Las Casas did not call for its abolition, for the abolition of the repartimiento, but for its reform. He wanted to change how it worked. Spaniards would no longer control specific individuals, but only receive a share of labor as a general right. The actual care and oversight of the indigenous people would be handled by administrators, by royal officer administrators. Las Casas makes projections about the enormous productivity of these reform repartimientos for both the Spaniards and the king, and he designs a series of idyllic self-sufficient communities. The new system would promote the recovery of the Indians and transform brutal servitude into a sort of gentler and protective communitarian order of exploitation overseen by the church and royal officials. According to Las Casas, the king must not let the Indians die. So your highness will have your income guaranteed and your lands will be populated. And this will be a very recurrent theme in these early Las Casas, the taxes and the income of the king. His first remedy was to order the suspension of work by Indians on all the island. He also urged the king to feed them and let them rest so they could regain their strength and get back to work. Life means food and rest. But let's be clear, this care was part of a colonial policy. The goal was economic, save the Indians so their labor could be used. Under Las Casas' plan, the crown would send 40 Castilian farmers with their families to each villa. Each would oversee 5 indigenous men and their families, creating a population of 1,000 or 2,000 people. The Spaniards would act as tutors since the Indians were seen as relatively incapable and defenseless minors. The category is called alieni juris, people in need of protection. Each community would be watched over by a legal advocate for the Indians, Procurador de Indios, separate from local officials. Daily life and production would be managed by 5 supervisors or mayordomos who would keep records of good, land, and people that is born, people that die, etc., etc. Las Casas believed these mixed communities would save the Indians, but there is an added bonus. For Las Casas, communal living was an anthropomorphic colonial technology. It didn't offer freedom, but it was meant to save and civilize. Las Casas claimed that Indians would no longer serve as they used to, nor be subject to the Christians in the old way, but in a new way that they can bear, so that they not die and instead they live. And you can hear the language is already biopolitical. But trying to reform a colonial system,
चाय कौन सा पिलाओगे वो अदरक वाली एकदम कोट के तो
But trying to reform a colonial system built on forced labor was full of contradictions. When Las Casas tried to apply his plan to Cumaná later in 1520-21, no Spanish farmer wanted to work. The project fell apart, ending in an indigenous uprising in Venezuela. After that failure, Las Casas became a Dominican friar and a step away from biopolitical dreams for 10 years. But let's return to 1516. Las Casas presents the indigenous population as the object of a political calculation of what Foucault described as control over propagation, birth, mortality, level of health, life expectancy, longevity, etc. The Memorial proposes a tolerable form of colonial rule, one that promotes indigenous life, civilization, and royal income. Las Casas insist again and again that preserving life will multiply the profits of the crown, which will be guaranteed. These communities would produce both spiritual and physical fruits, both depending on demographic stability and population growth. To support this, he included rules to promote marriage and births. Also, administrators would be rewarded for raising healthy children. If a child died, they would be severely punished. So with David, when we teach this, we talk about the sort of a prizes for keep the children alive till certain age, as a promotion as an incentive for royal officials to protect unproductive life, which is the life of children. This political concern with the salvific intervention of indigenous life extend to reproduction. He called for promoting conception and controlling sexuality through monogamous marriage and instruction, so that they will beget children and multiply. I'm not sure how Las Casas would instruct the Indians to reproduce, but that's what he says. Unfortunately, we are missing there the image. In any case, Las Casas also advocates for interracial marriage, believing that mestizaje will bring civilization, harmony, and especially more people and more royal income. This is Las Casas' main concern. The Indians and the Spanish farmer will mix, the sons of ones marrying the daughters of the others, and thus the people and the fruit of the land will multiply, and your highness will be served, and his royal income will grow. Las Casas proposes a mestizo biopolitical modernity, where colonial contradictions are resolved through population growth and racial mixing. He anticipates then two key axes of Latin American biopolitical thought, that to govern is to populate, and to govern is to mix races. But this vision is unequal. He suggests indigenous women marrying Spanish men, not the other way around. While royal laws in 1514 and 1515 allowed mixed marriage in the Antilles, Las Casas push further. He promotes mestizaje as a colonial policy for the repopulation of the islands. For Las Casas, bodies must not only be born and raised, they must also thrive. He called for sustento, or sustenance. In his materialistic view, and it is materialistic, feeding the Indians means preserving life and labor. The most basic remedy is always food. Feed the Indians, he writes, for therein lies their living or their dying. Hunger, he says, leads to death. Food equal life. Later in his story, would be a topic in all these books of the second Las Casas will be also very concerned with food. But in this plan, he imagines plenty of food, not only enough to feed everyone, but enough to sell for profit. He even proposes a full diet: bread, meat, fish, sweet potatoes, and peppers twice a day, plus cassave or yuca, and more for breakfast. The meat, he insists, must be fresh, not salted, because salted meat, he says, would kill them. This rich, meat-heavy diet is more like the one of the upper classes in Europe, unlike the simple bread and wine meals of the poor. Las Casas also wants to regulate work. He proposes a 5-day week with only 6 months of work per year. I wish we had something like that. 2 months of labor, followed by 2 months of rest. His schedule includes a 4-hour lunch break due to the Caribbean heat and 5 hours off during summer days. Las Casas separates mining from his utopian agrarian plan, maybe because it's hard to defend life and colonial mining at the same time. Unlike Thomas More's Utopia, where gold has little value, in the Spanish system, mining is central. Here is an image of Oviedo in which he presents mining as an idyllic scene with a lot of food, mandioca or cassave, mandioca or yuca in the back. In addition to farming villages, he proposed indigenous mining towns, and he designs a ratio gubernativa with organized space, a detailed payroll, and a strict work schedule. He even includes a chart with job titles and wages. And this is a chart that Las Casas himself does. So again, this is a different Las Casas. Each mining town would have 4 or 6 caciques and about 1,000 people placed near both the mines and the Spanish towns. This, he says, would reduce travel time, prevent escape or rebellion, improve control, and give the appearance of liberty. That's the quote at the end of this slide. It would seem to them that they have liberty. This phrase, appearance of liberty, reveals the contradiction of Las Casas' plan. He protects life only to hand it over to death. The agrarian communities provide the sustenance of colonial life, but the mines are the economic foundation of the system. His mining reforms try to protect health while preserving labor. He set a minimum age. Workers must be between 25 and 45, robust men only, and 1/3 of male Indians can be taken at a time. Only 1/3 can be taken to the mines to keep men in a reproductive age in towns, in the villas. Miners would work in 2 groups, he says, alternating 2 months of work and 2 of rest over 8 months, followed by 2 months of smelting the gold, when both groups would rest. So they would work 6 out of every 14 months. He also called for daily food, proper clothing, and 4 to 5 hours of midday rest to avoid illness and exhaustion. Las Casas system aims to foster life in order to exploit it without endangering it. It is a modern plan to tame primitive accumulation, making it humanitarian, if you will. Las Casas says that the Indians must rest, regain strength, and reproduce because the work, he says, is enormous. That painful labor lies at the heart of Christian humanitarianism, serving royal income and colonial accumulation. He writes, the Indians will live and multiply, and His Majesty's income will be perpetual. But this mining math, and again, this you wouldn't think that this is a work of Las Casas, what you are right now seeing, but it is. His mining math is both detailed and naive. Based on 4 Cuban villages, so he designed all these mining communities for Cuba because the Española is already destroyed. He calculates profits down to the last coin, claiming encomenderos could earn without governing or killing the Indians and without spending a dime. A biological mining utopia. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to my dear colleague and friend, David Solodkow.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about another interesting remedy proposed by Las Casas, the build of the hospital, of several hospitals indeed. Humanitarian rescue has deep roots in Christian teaching. Jesus called on us to care for those in need, what the Latin Bible called minoribus, or minors, later named pauper Christis and miserabilis personae. I was hungry and you gave me no food, etc., says the Bible. Inhospitality is a mortal sin because the poor sick are manifestations of Christ itself. Las Casas' proposal, though grounded in this tradition, are not acts of charity. They are instruments of colonial governance. His goal is to save the indigenous labor force, not out of mercy, but because its collapse threatens royal income from Gulf remissions. This marks a key shift from the ecclesiastical mandate of shelter to a royal duty, a move from spiritual charity to political public health. One of the key remedies in Las Casas Memorial de Remedios is the creation of a hospital in every town of the Spaniards, called the Hospital del Rey, the Hospital of the King. 16 hospitals in total, since there was 16 Spanish towns in Hispaniola. Each hospital was to be built in the form of the cross, would accommodate 200 sick Indians, 50 coats on each arm, with an altar at the center, so patients could attend Mass from their bed. Each hospital was to be staffed by a doctor, a surgeon, a pharmacist, and indigenous nurses and cooks. At the time, only a few precarious hospitals existed in Hispaniola, and they served Spaniards, not indigenous people. They were run by vecinos and religious order. None had doctors. In reality, sick Spaniards were cared for in indigenous villages by indigenous healers. The first functioning hospital in the Americas was San Nicolás de Bari, founded by Governor Fray Nicolás de Obando in Santo Domingo in 1503, but it could only care for 6 people and function as a shelter for the poor and sick. By the early 1500s, there was also a lazaretto, a hospice for lepers. near Santo Domingo. In 1512, the Hospital de San Andrés was founded, though it likely didn't begin operating until later in the century. All of these hospitals were precarious. Their purpose was to offer shelter, not to restore health. In contrast, Las Casas proposed a very different kind of hospital, one meant to treat the illness of the indigenous people suffering under colonial exploitation. While Las Casas plan echoed the old Christian duty to protect and care for the fragile and sick, it also marked a shift. In the Middle Ages, hospitals were about hospitality, not healing. As Foucault notes, until the late 17th century, care for the sick was still framed as charity, not medicine. Hospital personnel were not destined to cure the sick. They were devoted to acts of mercy. If we were to interview a pre-modern hospital official and ask him, "Sir, what do you do at the hospital?" the answer would likely be, "I provide protection to the helpless and assist them so they may die a good death." It was not until the 18th century, says Foucault, that the function of the hospital doctor appeared and assumed the main responsibility for hospital organization. By the 16th century, European hospital existed somewhere in between the old medieval idea of refugee for the poor, unprotected and sick, what we call caritas, and the modern institution of the hospital, dedicated to the cure and treatment of the disease. A quick but important aside. As Ahmed Ragab points out, medical hospitals in the Islamic world were devoted to healthcare long before similar institutions appeared in Europe. In the 12th and 13th centuries, hospitals in Egypt and Syria, built in the shape of a cross, with pharmacies, specialized wards, and trained medical staff, were far more advanced than anything that existed in Milan or in Florence at the time. More on Italian hospitals in a minute. Las Casas Hospital was meant to address medical needs, incorporate modern hygienic practices, and serve as a tool of governance to protect the health of the labor force, ensure the reproduction of life, and ultimately support economic production in colonial rule. He saw indigenous hospitals as the responsibility of the sovereign. With its biopolitical focus, the Las Casas Hospital anticipates state protection of life and offers an early form of Renaissance biopower, a model that, though rare in Europe, promoted the cruciform hospital as something we now recognize as modern. Las Casas Hospital was designed in the shape of a cross, with an altar at the center. At first glance, this might seem medieval or old-fashioned. By that time, the immersion of cities under bourgeoisie prompted the separation of hospitals from churches. But despite its religious symbolism, the cross-shaped layout actually reflected the most modern hospital design trends of the period. While the cross might appear to be a remnant of Christian medieval thought, its design also expressed the idea of a Christus medicus, Christ as a healer identified with the suffering indigenous body. but beyond symbolism, have a practical medical function: better airflow, lighting, separation of infected patients, and waste removal. In short, the hospital was designed to promote health and to serve the needs of colonial governance. What makes the Hospital of the King modern isn't its shape, but rather its purpose. It was a biopolitical project designed to recoup indigenous people, extend their life, and generate wealth for the crown. The cruciform hospitals followed the model of the key Italian Renaissance hospitals in Florence and Milan, which were later copied in Spain under the Catholic kings. The first known example was the Ospedale degli Uomini in Florence, Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova, founded in 1288, though the cross-shaped layout wasn't completed until around the 1500. It began as a modest shelter, but became a true hospital with a pharmacy and a patient's recovery rate over 85%. In 1457, Francesco Sforza founded the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan as a gift to the poor of Christ. Designed by Antonio Berlino, known as Filarete, it featured two Greek cross-shaped buildings, one for men, one for women, with an altar at the center of each in a large central courtyard. But for Filarete, the altar was symbolic. Filarete devoted a short paragraph to the altar and several pages to a complex system of toilet and sewage evacuation. He was more concerned with excrement than with sacraments. The Ospedale Maggiore influenced other hospitals, including the Ospedale di Pamatone in Genoa and the Hospital Real de Todos os Santos in Lisbon. The modern cruciform hospital offered major sanitary advantages. It separated patients into wards, improved lighting and airflow, reduced overcrowding, and allowed for more efficient use of space. The Ospedale Maggiore set the standard for the modern Renaissance hospital. This model spread to Spain in the 16th century, to France in the 17th, and though less commonly, to Catholic England. There, the cross-shaped design appeared only once in the Savoy Hospital, reportedly founded by Henry VII around 1509. The Savoy had separate buildings for the sick and the poor, distinguishing lives that were unhealthy from those seen as unproductive. These modern cruciform hospitals were not like the old medieval shelters for the destitute. As John Henderson shows, they were not acts of charity, they were sanitary institutions. Here, we see the birth of the modern hospital as an expression of sovereign power and as a tool of governance and management of public health. This Renaissance cruciform model was reproduced by the Spanish Catholic kings, who founded several cross-shaped hospitals, including the monumental Hospital de los Reyes de Santiago and the Hospital Real de Granada. Las Casas would have been familiar with this building. The Catholic monarch commissioned both from the brothers Enrique and Anton Egas. And by 1515, when Las Casas returned to Spain, he likely knew the Santiago hospitals before writing his memorial. However, in Spain, the modernity of this building was not medical. it was political. They were not healing machines. They were monuments of the power of the crown in two strategic cities, Santiago, the peninsular Jerusalem, and Granada, recently reconquered from the Muslims. The Hospital de los Reyes was originally designed as a Latin cross or crux commissa with three wings, while the hospital imagined by Las Casas followed the plan of a Greek cross, crux in missa quadrata, four equal wings meeting at a central altar. In this sense, the Las Casas Hospital is architecturally closer to the Hospital de la Santa Cruz de Toledo, and especially to the Royal Hospital of Granada. Let me repeat, in Spain, these hospitals were monuments to royal power, but the monumentality of the Las Casas Hospital of the King is mostly in the name. In appearance, it will resemble a large heart in the shape of a cross. These hospitals were meant to represent the crown's authority overseas, but also to care for the indigenous population and treat health as a public concern. In short, the Las Casas Hospital was both a tool for collective care and a symbol of the king's biopolitical sovereignty. Las Casas' ideas align with the crown's growing efforts, starting in the late 15th century to regulate medicine, pharmacy, and public health. Laws like the Real Pragmática of 1477 and the creation of the Real Tribunal del Protomedicato aimed to control medical practices and ensure safety. The Protomedicato was a central body with both administrative and judicial power. It examined doctors, surgeons, healers, and pharmacists, and inspected pharmacies across the kingdom. By the 1900s, the crown also mandated the destruction of false or contaminated medicines. So by the time Las Casas wrote his proposal, pharmacies were already regulated in the name of public health and pharmaceutical effectiveness. By the early 1500s, new European hospitals often included pharmacies. Hospitals in Milan, Santiago, and Granada all had pharmacies, evidence of the state growing control over pharmaceutical practice. Las Casas' concern with public health also appears in Thomas More's Utopia, written the same year as the Memorial. More, imagine a biopolitical kingdom with large hospitals, staffed by doctors and filled with medicines. For both thinkers, the hospital was more than a place for treating illness. It was a public institution to preserve life and efficient healing machine. As noted earlier, the symbolic center of Las Casas Hospital of the King is the altar. Though religious, it is also has also a medical rationale. It allowed patients to attend Mass without disrupting rest or recovery. Here, modernity brings together bio and pneumopolitics. Las Casas Hospital payroll includes a doctor, a surgeon, a pharmacist, with a well-stocked pharmacy and individual beds, kitchens, utensils, and clothing. The doctor is a public servant responsible for the population's health. Both doctor and pharmacists are well paid, 250 and 200 castellanos, matching or exceeding the salary of the Procurador de Indios, the top official in Las Casas Utopia. In fact, doctors in this Indian hospital will have earned more than many royal doctors in Spain. Each hospital del Rey had 2 male Spanish hospitaleros or head nurses paid 40 castellanos a year. Alongside them, 4 to 6 indigenous male nursing aides were to provide basic care. While salaries for the indigenous aides are not listed, Las Casas considered their work essential. They provided frontline care, and because of their language and cultural knowledge, helped bridge communication between patients and medical staff. Though Las Casas didn't speak indigenous languages himself, he understood how essential these aids were. Las Casas also required indigenous women to serve as paid hospital cooks. Often, wives of the aides, these women brought essential knowledge of diet and food preparation. In addition to cooking for the patients and staff, they made kitchenware and were to be compensated for their labor. In Las Casas plans, mayordomos overseeing indigenous labor had to report illness and send the sick to the hospital, which would include animals for transportation. Unlike religious institutions, the Hospital del Rey was run by permanent lay staff, not priests, were on the payroll. This marked a shift from charity to a bureaucratic model of indigenous care. The hospital reflected modern hygienic standards, patients' isolation, individual beds, and cloth-covered mattresses to prevent contagion. Countering the common and deadly practice of bed sharing, Las Casas insisted patients not sleep on the floor, but on proper beds. 200 mattresses per hospital, made of canvas and filled with hay or wool, each with 2 washable sheets. These linens were crucial for hygienic and regular cleaning. At the time, 200 individual beds with linens were extraordinary. Most hospitals had shared beds. The Hospital de los Reyes in Santiago had 80 to 100 beds. Granada's Royal Hospital, just 24. And even Florence famed Santa Maria Nuova had only 250. With 200 beds per hospital, Las Casas designed much or exceeded the scale of royal institutions. For him, beds, mattresses, and sheets weren't luxurious. They were instruments of healing and life. It is clear we are not talking about a parish or a shelter for the poor, but a health center designed to provide medicine, rest, and diet for the recovery of life. A hospital imagined as a healing machine. Still, Las Casas wants the king to order the construction, but not pay for it. The hospital network would be funded through forced loans from the colonists. The Hospital of the King is both a bio and a pneumopolitical project meant to restore both material and spiritual life. It cares for the body and soul, offering refuge, healing, and spiritual solace for indigenous people, all under the sovereignty of the king in service of colonial exploitation. The hospital will have protected the health of the labor force, enabled the reproduction of life, and ultimately supported wealth, production, and colonial rule. In short, it meant to be a tool for governance designed to extract labor.
Okay, and now we come to the conclusion. We are a little bit over time, but please forgive us for that. The memorial ends with an utopian biopolitical vision of colonial order. The Indians will not be killed, nor will be diminished, because giving little food to those who have not a lot of work will no longer be allowed. Instead, the Indians will multiply and the kid will be able to distribute them in new repartimientos, gaining many and perpetual incomes, which each day will be increased. Yet, a dark cloud hangs over this humanitarian dream of endless accumulation. Las Casas warns the king, if he does not act, he may forget about the Indies, those already discovered and those still to be discovered, or rather, those already destroyed and those still to be destroyed. I mean, this apocalyptic warning, the text reiterates its pneumopolitical teleology. The first and last goal that ought to compel the remedy of those sad souls should be God, and to bring them to heaven, because he did not redeem them, nor he discovered them in order to have them sent to hell. But history will show us that hell was built there in the Caribbean, on earth, a colonial hell. Las Casas agrarian and mining communities were a biopolitical dream within a colonial nightmare, a humanitarian and deeply naive effort to tame the violence of primitive accumulation. In Marxist terms, Las Casas wanted to preserve indigenous life from extinction in order to prolong its exploitation. He sought to replace the wolf, the repartimiento and the encomendero, the wolf, with a more humane vampire, the new communities that would extend life for the sake of labor. Also, unsurprisingly, in his 11th remedy, Las Casas asked the king to replace his own Indians with 20 blacks or other slaves in the mines, and to allow colonists to own black and white slaves brought from Castile. He repeated this request in writing from 1518 to the late 30s. But by 1545, Las Casas openly condemned the unjust captivity of the blacks and admitted his error, saying that he was sure that God, in his divine judgment, would not forgive him for it. As you see, during several years, he proposed the slavery of African people. This contradiction between defending Indians and endorsing Black or African slavery has long troubled readers of Las Casas. But in biopolitical terms, there is no contradiction at all. Colonial humanitarianism was the language of the empire, not the logic of political economy. Colonial biopolitics involved not only the power to make live, but also the power to let die, to abandon certain lives to death in the mines. In 1516, there were almost no indigenous life left to save, barely 12,000 individuals. The biopolitical solution became necropolitical, to replace the depleted indigenous labor force with a steady flow of expendable life from the Atlantic slave trade. Las Casas realized this by 1545, and by then he was not sure that he even deserved the God infinite greatness and forgiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professors Carlos Jáuregui and David, for this wonderful lecture, in which you have basically brought to light the the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas, especially the Memorial de los Remedios, the early writings, where he seems to be proposing a so-called humanist plan for colonial rule, while at the same time advocating for it to be profitable. And though focusing on the elements of repopulation of the land, and that was the focus of the colonial project, enrich the royal coffers and expand Christianity. However, the efforts that Las Casas made to balance this preservation of life with the demands of colonial exploitation had presented internal contradictions, which then collapsed under the weight of those contradictions. So rather than seeing Las Casas as simply humanitarian or utopian, but actually what you have argued, and very well, is that it represents the emergence of the colonial biopolitical framework, which sees human life as a resource which needs to be cultivated, preserved, and exploited in accordance to the demands and the needs and the constraints of the political economy under colonialism. The other is interesting aspect which your book brings to light and which you have also discussed is the emergence of the hospital as an institution which then serves again the colonial logic for exploitation and for caring and rescuing, healing the indigenous population so that they survive, they reproduce, and then they can become the colonial subjects. So the objective in both, I mean, this utopian projects that you discussed of the agrarian communities that he conceptualized, as well as the mining community, and we see the contradictions between the utopian and what you describe as the dystopian hell of the mines, where basically the bodies are kept alive in order to go and die in the mines. So this basically the hospital also as a place or an institution which would be which would support the colonial project, the economic objective, and ensuring the health and availability of labor force necessary for production and increasing the royal coffers income. So basically they were instruments of governmental power, and this aligns so well with the way Foucault has described institutions but he looks at it, of course, in the 19th century. So this your presentation is really so illuminating because it traces this back to the colonial times and to see. And what I really found fascinating was, I mean, which I was perhaps my ignorance, I did not have that much, I was not so much aware of it, perhaps, of the way the hospitals were designed. That was a very, very interesting aspect on which you shed light. So thank you once again for this wonderful talk and giving us this opportunity to go into the details and into depths of how though appearing to be humanitarian and utopian. And in fact, I like what you say at the end about the language of human rights, contemporary human rights, where the idea of charity is so much intertwined in that, embedded in it. So once again, and without coming in the way of I'm sure all of you have questions or comments and would like to ask questions to the two speakers. So please raise your hands in the box so that I can call on you to ask your questions or give your comments. Yeah, Java. Yeah.
Ma'am, am I audible? I just wanted to check.
And Java, you may briefly introduce yourself. And Java is an independent researcher, but you may introduce yourself and then ask your question. Thank you, Java.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm Java, and I take classes for the master's program for IGNOU, which is the leading public university in distance education in India. And about 2 years ago, they started the master's in Spanish. First of all, I really want to thank Professors Carlos Jáuregui and David Solodkow for deepening my understanding of Bartolomé de las Casas. And I'm especially grateful that your analysis is so rooted in materiality. The details of food that you give, bread made from yucca and sweet potatoes, or in the hospital, this insistence on mattresses and clean sheets, which don't really mean anything to the indigenous population. When we teach Bartolomé de las Casas, we focus on his debates with Sepulveda in the imperial courts of Spain. And we teach him, of course, we say he's paternalistic, but we also focus on the fact that he represents an internal fracture in the colonial project, and that this questioning of the legitimacy of Christian conquest had started way back, almost at the start itself. So I want to ask the professors that, how is this fresh understanding of Bartolomé de las Casas, how is it generative? Do we now find ourselves saying there was no internal fracture? Or do we see him merely as as another person who is participating in this tussle between the church and the secular authorities in colonial America? So if you could throw some light, is there a real transition between his Memorial and Brevísima Relación de las Indias, or is it just a power play? He is on the secular side to begin with when he's an encomendero, and when he's Fray Bartolomé, he is condemning the administration for the exploitation.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very important question. Las Casas was, for most of the time he wrote and thought, he was not a counter-colonial thinker. But he even wrote a treaty that published in 1552, right? 42?
42, sí.
42, the Tratado 52 was published, the Tratado Comprobatorio de Imperio Soberano, which is a thesis to justify the sovereignty of the Spanish kings over the Americas. Later, and we're talking about the 1560s, he changed his heart and he thought that he had no right to defend the Indians, but the Indians had the right to defend themselves and to erase the Spanish rule from earth, and that right was their right till the end of time. So he basically proposed resistance to tyranny as the only remedy. But that's the end, at the very end, very disillusioned with the idea of a legal or royal remedy. He looked for remedies during all of his time. Now, for you may be interested in another debate, not the debate of 51, but the debate of Valladolid, but the debate that happened in 1517, because Las Casas was also involved in a debate with several intellectuals. One of them, a very important economist, Davila. What was his name? I forgot his name. Well, anyway, his last name was Davila. And they were discussing what was more likely to kill the Indians, slavery or a reform encomienda. And Davila was saying, no, slavery is better because you are the property, you take care of your own property, while the encomienda was not a property right, was a temporary right, a concession. So a concession would imply a logic of full and cruel exploitation till the very end to extract as much profit as possible, while slavery was a more humane solution. So all this discussion are happening in 1517 and 1518 till Las Casas finally abandoned the idea of saving indigenous life in the Caribbean and moves to Panama. So these are, I think Las Casas was many Las Casas, right? Many Las Casas. And this early Las Casas was an economist and an aspirante, I don't know how to say in English aspirante, un aspirante de consejero real.
Wannabe.
A wannabe counselor of the king. The second Las Casas, we don't know anything because he just went to the convent and we don't know anything, except that he knew about the disaster of his project because news arrived that he had died and been killed by the Indians. And he knew of those, he learned about those news and was surprised and thought, okay, this is a sign of God. I should be buried in a convent and start thinking and studying instead of talking about what I don't know. And then after the 30s, the Las Casas that is very canonical and we know. Las Casas only till the end opposed the Spanish Empire sovereignty of over the Americas. But before that, he was very much in support. The empire, as you say, ended speaking a new language, and that new language could be called, you say, Las Casian, no?
Las Casian. Yeah.
Las Casian is a new language, and is the language of empire. So the empire co-opted, absorbed the language in order to talk. So the king became the protectors of the Indian.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, Vijay, if
Yeah. Ira, who was that?
It's Ira from Hyderabad.
Yeah, yeah. But I can't see your mic on. Yeah, you can ask your question, Ira. Yeah, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
yes, now can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. We can hear you. Yeah, great.
Okay, sorry for that glitch. I'm Ira from the English and Foreign Languages University, and I teach history, and personally, I'm also very interested in the history of the period that we are in right now in this talk. And I have one observation which I would love to have any corrections on. And I have two questions following it. The first observation was how much these hospitals in the form of a cross reminded me of a panopticon where the cross the altar in the center is the very, very visible presence of both the secular as well as the religious power, and which keeps alive in the mind of all the people who are there the dynamics of the relationship with that center. So I would, if I, I would please like any expansion on that you could give me. The second one was that in the colonies, very soon as the Indians start dying off, were these hospitals also meant for the mestizos? Because Bartolomé de las Casas is encouraging mestizo offspring. So were these hospitals equally meant for them? And secondly, to what extent does this, it does, but this kind of biopolitics which operated for the Indians, uh, I think I'm right to say that it continues even in the later centuries when the African slavery took hold of the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. The cruciform hospital is not yet related to what Foucault we call in 19th century the panopticon. Not yet. It's a different idea because the panopticon is thought of controlling population and surveillance. But the cruciform hospital instead the idea of the cross is not that much related to religion, but to sanitary purpose, to hygienic techniques, the separation, the differentiation between men and women, the different types of diseases for the ventilation, for lighting, circulation of the air, evacuation of sewage. So the idea of the cross is not that much related with the religious purpose, but with biopolitics means for cure the population, really. There were, in fact, in Las Casas idea, in Las Casas plan, the first one, the original one, in his payroll, in his list of personnel, hospital personnel, there's not any religious personnel, no priest, for example. So he's not thinking really about the spirit and the soul. And that's why the idea of a cross may confuse us. But the idea is not a religious one. Of course, it's the cross, it's Christ, of course. But the idea is to save life in order to keep exploiting them. So it's a different type of political notion of health.
Um, I, I could add only that he was very conscious of the advances of the shape of the cross in Renaissance hospitals in Italy, particularly, because cruciform hospitals in Spain were not medical, were just monuments of power. So the cross is religious in a symbolic sense, but is mainly sanitary technology. The temperature would be less, than other forms of hospital. You can throw most of the waste through the windows very easily. You have better illumination, better lighting, etc. Like David say, there's another institution that he creates in this first memorial, which is the Casa del Rey. That's a different thing. And Casa del Rey has a little bit of control, right? The idea is to take some refugees and recoup them for labor, but also to bring some unruly indigenous, basically the people, the Guanabeyes and Guanatabeyes, which were people not into agriculture. They were decidedly against agriculture. So since his idea was very much based on agriculture, these were seen as savages and they needed to be reformed and transformed. So La Casa del Rey had this vigilance
more Foucauldian,
more Foucauldian
yes. Idea of surveillance and transformation of life, what we call pneumopolitics,
which is cultural transformation. Now the center of the cross, the optics of the center of the cross, where the sick people, the sick Indians, could actually see or hear mass, not the other way around. The priests see the sick, so it was not panoptic. Now, it was not designed for mestizos, no. It was designed only for indigenous, which is a little bit crazy because we're talking about few indigenous people in La Española, right? We have 12,000, give or take, different 11 to 12,000. And we were talking about 16 hospitals with 200 beds. So it would be better than any place in Switzerland, the medical attention of the indigenous people. And this is really good. There's no life to save. This effort arrives too late for the biopolitical purpose of saving lives.
Yeah, and just one more thing is that the indigenous population had a long and large tradition of local medicine, so they didn't need new medicines.
They didn't like the hospital.
They think that the hospital were places where people go to die, not to save life. So they really were against the idea of this new medicine. But the problem also is that they are not sick people. They are put into that position because of colonial rule.
They're making sick. They're made sick. This is not like sick people in nature, right? So the real ill is colonialism.
That's the virus. That's the virus.
That's the actual illness. So the only remedy is the one that he doesn't address. He is more remiendo than remedio. And he actually used those words later in his works. He said, we just give remiendos instead of remedios. Now, for about the Black, the African slaves, they start arriving in a new cycle that we call the cycle of sugar, which is something we work in the book. Is the slaves that are starting to arrive since early in the 16th century, but they are going to be brought more and more as soon as the sugar cane becomes an industry, a real industry, which is later in the 16th century. African slaves were too expensive at the beginning of the 16th century to make economic sense. So Las Casas proposed 5,000 Caribbean Indians as slaves. That's something that we didn't mention because that's another memorial from that era. But he proposed to capture 5,000 indigenous Caribbeans, which were not as nice as the Indians from La Española, in order to provide the labor necessary to produce in La Española. And then later he has many other proposals for slavery for both indigenous people and African.
However, he passed to history in a very unjust way because though he proposed several times slavery, 20 slave for the mind of the king, 20 slave for here and there, he is not the responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. So that's an error, that's a historical error. And he's also so regret about it that he says that God will never forgive him for he having proposed that idea.
So hospital for medical attention for Black slaves actually is something from the late 16th century, and it happens in Cartagena de Indias, in today's Colombia, with the first efforts to systematically attend to the medical needs of slaves.
Thank you very much.
I was also thinking that when you talk about the fear of the hospitals as houses of death, so largely that was also because they were seen by the Indians. These hospitals were seen, I mean, as you said, too late also to save any lives, but also they were also alien to their way of life, and they did not see them as places where they would want to go to get any succor in case of illness. Just a small addition to what you already said. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Correct. Even we say that the first hospital was San Nicolás de Bari. Well, the first functional hospital was San Nicolás de Bari, only for 6 people, basically 6 Spaniards. So it's really small. But the first hospital was created by Christopher Columbus in early, I think, in 1496. But nobody wanted to go there. Not even the Spaniards wanted to go there. And if you got sick, you go to the healer, to the indigenous healer, because you had better chances than just with some surgeon or barber that was going to kill you. So that hospital lasted for just 6-7 months. The ruins are there, though.
Yeah.
The ruins were recently rediscovered.
Also, later, Hernán Cortés in Mexico, the king asked him if he wants doctors sent to him. And he said, no, I have a lot of healers here. He also thought that the indigenous medicine was better than the occidental medicine.
At least less dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Amrit, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, ma'am. It's I have unmuted. Thank you, Carlos and David, for such an enlightening talk on Bartolomé de las Casas. I have a question regarding primitive accumulation of capital, because you spoke about primitive accumulation of capital, something about which Marx has also written in detail in his in Capital. And when he talks about primitive accumulation of capital, he talks about how producers were ripped from their means of production. And he talks about expropriation of labor and expropriation of nature. Like Marx considers that this goes hand in hand. And at the same time, unlike Adam Smith, when he's writing in Wealth of Nation, he thinks that there is possibility of humanitarian approach to primitive accumulation of capital, and that's why he says that it is because capitalists they were able to have this industrial revolution possible. Marx says that no, primitive accumulation of capital was completely soaked in the blood of the laborers and expropriation of nature. So is can we say that this humanitarian approach to primitive accumulation is possible? Because Marx completely refutes that when he writes about primitive accumulation in Capital. So he completely rejects any humanitarian approach of to primitive accumulation of capital.
Correct. You are correct. The first system, there is an expropriation of means of production and also expropriation of labor, live. And we can think two systems of mining in La Española, one from 1492 to 1503, till Obando arrives. Obando is the governor, in which the system is just robbery, just piling.
The first system.
Yeah, it's called drenaje is the technical name, drenaje, which means just collecting all the gold that is in the hands of the Indians in the form of artifacts. It is calculated by economists that during those 7 years or so, the gold that was produced and processed in 1,000 years was collected and expropriated from the indigenous. After 1503, the new system implies encomienda, which means expropriating labor, right? Which is a different thing, taking labor and life in conditions of basically slavery, in a case of sheer primitive accumulation, colonial primitive accumulation, ruled by violence and nothing else. But after 1503, this is organized, some sort of organized by Oviedo, by some rules, by some repartimiento. And what Las Casas come to think is that this system is exhausting life, destroying life, like a wolf would do, and that he needs more like a vampire, right? He says cultivating life in order to extract labor, because without healthy bodies and without healthy population and without people living, there is no way to exploit labor. And so he wants to tame primitive accumulation and make it into something more modern, like today would consider exploitation of labor modern, because we receive some healthcare, or well, at least we used to receive some good healthcare and some help to promote healthy lives in order to be able to extract labor.
Yeah, Marx will call this reproduction the proletariat, right? So in Las Casas is the idea that reproducing life is like reproducing the proletariat.
The prolet.
Right? The prolet, the idea of, taking care of the child. There is a price in order to keep the life of the children. So the importance put into the reproduction of life is the idea that it is not possible to reproduce capital or gains without reproducing at the same time the life of the population.
And then he make a distinction between productive lives and unproductive lives. And unproductive lives that are potentially productive, like the children, and unproductive life and the sick, and also unproductive life because they are elderly people that need to be
or cultural forms of life that are savage in a way that we can transform into productive life.
So the conversion is more the conversion into proletariat, into workers, than conversion into Christian.
So the establishment of hospitals in the colonial time can be seen as something which facilitated production of productive life, and hence helped to speed up the process of primitive accumulation of capital.
Could you repeat the question? I'm maybe because of the fan on top of you is a little bit.
Okay, so like I was saying, so the establishment of hospital in the colonial times, can we say that it actually helped in the production of this productive life of the laborers, and hence it helped, or it helped in the process. No, it is smoothened the process of primitive accumulation of capital, the expropriation of labor.
Of course,
yes.
Yes, absolutely. It is the original accumulation of capital, of course.
And this will continue in several forms, not all the same. But we also need to understand that Mexico changed the equation, right? About 15, 17, 18, when Spaniards arrived to Yucatan and then to Mexico, the life becomes cheaper. It's quite cheaper because of the abundance. And then the center of operation moves from the Caribbean to Mexico and then to Peru. And then there is plenty of life, at least till the Cocolizzi and the pandemics and the life in Mexico start becoming very fragile and scarce. But for almost 20 years, the Spaniards abandoned the biopolitical projects because of Mexico, because of the abundance of life. And then there is a primitive accumulation too, although the experience of the Caribbean is going to change the experience of Mexico because they know that indigenous life is a fundamental factor in political economy.
And when we refer to the project of Las Casas as a modern project, we are thinking about primitive accumulation because it is not possible to have later on the Industrial Revolution without taking into account the money that was necessary to build this revolution. And this revolution was financed by the gold extracted with the slave labor force in colonial times.
Marx, when he talks about primitive accumulation, he mentions the Americas, right? It's one of the few moments in which he actually mentioned the Americans. Say this was just sheer blood and sweat extraction of capital. We tend to identify life, the category life of biopolitics, with category of labor in Marx. We conflict, we kind of put it together as one. Probably Foucault wouldn't like that, you know, but we took that risk. For us, when we say life, we're talking about an abstract category. We are not talking about the life of David. The life of David is irrelevant.
Yes, I know.
But life as labor,
It's
labor
an
force.
abstraction.
An abstraction, exactly. An abstraction of a category that is not. Is the category that is discussed in a meeting, in a room with a graph.
It's an equation, it's a calculation.
Not before anybody. So it's a life of nobody. It's life as a category. And that thus the Indian is undifferentiated. It's just work.
Vijaya, if you allow me.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yes,
sure, of
just
course.
to continue on this comment on, that the indigenous life as an economic category in the productive process during primitive accumulation. And you were very rightly pointing out that Marx actually refers to, the extirpation and the enslavement and the entombment in mines of the indigenous, when he talks. But he also talks about the fact that in New England, in North America, something slightly different was happening, which you mentioned is happening in the case of Mexico, that it is actually the land that they want, and therefore the settlers want to do away with the indigenous lives, not save them, but do away with the indigenous life because what they want is land and to fill the land with the settlers. So, so there is a different face to the indigenous life as an economic category in that case. Yeah.
And I think you are. I wouldn't venture a general hypothesis about North America colonization, but I would say that the model of colonization in the Americas is not the colonization of the conquest of land and resources as much as the conquest and colonization of life, of labor. And that's quite clear even when they discover the Minas de Plata in El Potosí, or when they discover yacimientos gold in Panama and Colombia, is always labor. Because one thing that scared Spanish colonies more than indigenous resistance is working labor, themselves. That's just out of the question. So labor, indigenous labor is very important. Also because mining is labor intensive. We don't have modern mining at that time. And remember the image that we have in our cover? Yeah. It's an idealized vision of somebody who actually did mining, which is Oviedo. He was a minero.
And the official historian of the ground of the Spanish.
Exactly, and he presents this image, which is idyllic and food, and the woman is the one who is cleaning the arena aurifera, and she's gordita, very, very good and good health, almost pregnant. But that's not the situation. Once women are removed from the community, is gone, is done. And besides that, he himself tells us that the indigenous people and women aborted, killed children, infanticide, suicide, and all this. And we analyze all these death that appear as an insurrectional and counter-colonial activity. We think, like Benjamin also thought, suicide is a way to subtract your life from labor. It's one of the ways to see suicide in the mines, or suicide in horrible conditions of slavery. So yes, colonization is colonization of life. Conquest is the conquest of life, and secondarily resources and land.
And will also be these ways during the foundation of the new state republics during the 19th century. For instance, after the killing of all the indigenous population in Argentina, or the killings of the indigenous population in the expansion to the West, in the Americas, the biopolitical idea will be to export people from Europe and to bring it there.
That's the solution.
So that's the solution. The solution is always more life in order to replace or to substitute the life that is gone, or a new form of life, basically.
Thank you. Just as a matter,
would you like to?
Just as a matter of anecdote, well, it's history actually, not just anecdote. I'd like to tell you that, this is something probably others know, but I discovered it only recently in the course of my classes, that Mughal India, in the early 16th century, the Mughal India was a very big economic power and was one of the major importers of silver coming from Potosi. So 60% of the silver which was consumed in India, in Mughal India, in the early 16th century, actually, was all the silver which was coming from the Americas. So there's a connection. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Vibha, would you like to ask a question or comment? You have to unmute yourself.
No, I am one of the persons who have always, I'm sorry to say that, but I have always looked at Las Casas with a bit of a suspicion. Because I have done my PhD in Havana, Cuba, on Jose Marti. And Marti has several pieces on Bartolomé de las Casas, and always is presented as a great humanitarian and, the human rights defender and things like that. But what puzzles me, and maybe it is a historical, or maybe it is sort of a view, a perspective from the 21st century. I have also worked a lot into cell, for example, in the global South, Boaventura, and I feel that the perspective which we would like to, or the approach which we would like to adopt in order to read Bartolomé de las Casas, which has also, I know that, which has also inspired you, is Gustavo Gutierrez.
Yes.
And Gustavo Gutierrez, and you have so many epigraphs in your book taken from Gustavo Gutierrez. So I was thinking that you will refer to that question of Amrit about the primitive capital, accumulation of primitive capital, because he has, your book I think starts with that epigraph of Gustavo Gutierrez where he talks about the accumulation. And he, of course, has a liberation theology approach as well as a Marxist approach. You know, I have students who have done their PhD comparing Gutierrez with al-Shariati in Iran and all that, and looking at liberation theology from that angle. So this is something which has puzzled me, that he was a genius in that sense that he, at that time in the 15th, early 16th century, he thought of such minute details about the survival, necessity of survival of your subject. And it is, of course, as you have put it so nicely, so deep insight you have given to us, is that he wanted the Indians to survive, not because he was a great sort of humanist in the sense, but as you have already explained, that he is because he wants to take them as a labor. So I want to know that why we cannot, why even in your books, which is absolutely, and I have not finished reading it, but it is absolutely insightful. And so many things fell in place in my mind when I read all these in your books, many chapters, which still I must finish reading. So I was thinking that why we only talk about Las Casas limits. Is it a man who is not born in his time? And if he had he was born, supposing a few centuries later, or is it that we are creating a myth around Las Casas and his proposals and trying to satisfy ourselves that, look, what a great humanitarian was born at that time. And actually, all the readings of Las Casas in the 19th century is about Las Casas as a great humanitarian and yes. All. And it has puzzled me because, of course, I'm in the 21st century and I speak from the point of view of our left politics. But at the same time, I want to know that were we really creating a myth? And is your book going to serve us as a deconstructive model for all what was served around Las Casas?
Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate your question. We have a methodology with our work with David, which is we take a book, which is just, we finish a book or an article, and we send it to between 10 and 15 different colleagues, and wait for the response, and then rewrite some of the book. And that happened to us, and one of the responses was by Raimundo González, a historian, very prominent historian in Dominican Republic. And he said, why are you attacking Las Casas? Why are you seeing only this negative? So we rewrote on several parts, several chapters, and you could see actually references to Raimundo. I think Las Casas was a man of his time, and we use the metaphor of playing cards with the devil, or sitting with the devil to talk. And when you sit with the devil to talk, you end up talking a language that is quite infernal. And Las Casas had to talk the language of his time, the language of Avila, the language of Cardenal Cisneros, the language of even the language of his contradictory, his enemies. And we don't know what was in the heart of a man 500 years ago. The only thing that we know is that he wrote this essay and this memorial and many others. The first one with the help of Palacio Rubio, so we don't know who is talking, Palacio Rubio or Las Casas, but we know that the language is a political economy language, and we know that what is the argument, and it makes sense for the time and for the kind of discussion that was being prompted by the reduction of gold production in the Española, which was the main concern of the king, Fernando, and then no Charles I, because Charles I, was a 16-year-old teenager who didn't speak any Romance language as far as we know. But the Flanders people, the people from Flanders are concerned about the gold. And everybody is talking about that. And that's the language that has to be taught. And Las Casas have that discussion. And at the very end of his life, which is the Father Gutierrez rescued this very radical thought, Las Casas thought of the late 50s and 60s, early 60s, in which Las Casas is talking about restitution of the land, restitution of the. But Las Casas in the 1516, he's not talking about restitution. He says he literally says restitution is impossible, but we have a solution, which is called composición. La composición is a tax for illegal or illicit fortunes. So, for example, today is used for mafia fortunes that need to be legalized or things like that. Because even if your economic activity is illegal or immoral, you have to pay taxes. So Las Casas was thinking about that in the 1516, but later he was saying, no, restitution. And we don't even have the right to claim for the restitution. Indigenous people will forever do it, right? So it's a different. We are not better than Las Casas. We always wonder, what would I do if I were in that position? And I don't think my face helped. I think I would probably be one of the enemies of Las Casas or something. Who knows, right? But I don't pretend to be a better man in the 21st century than a man who was there in the field trying to do something while I am teaching, my students at the university and reading dissertations.
I completely agree with you that, of course, that's what I'm saying, that if you look at Las Casas, and especially what has come out in your book, he was, to the minute detail of even thinking of people's salary and all. It's a great political economist as well as demographer. I don't know. But at the same time, he doesn't come out of this whole paradigm of the colonial mindset, no? And so loyal to the king. Even in his debate with Sepulveda, I don't think that he's coming out of that paradigm. And also and that's what Gutierrez actually is llamar nuestra atención, no? That this is something which is that has to be taken into account, and that is the primitive accumulation of labor, no? So he's only talking about the life of the people, the king's coffers, and reproduction and saving the life to produce and enrich the coffers. And then the third, people also think of his Christendom, no, the Christian souls. But that is, I don't know why is it called Christian souls, that he's converting, transformation to civilized and some from savage to, and the Christian, enriching the Christian souls and all that. But if he was not a fraile, then why was he why we are looking at Las Casas from that angle, at least from the angle of the Christian? So for me, he's a terribly patronizing, he's a terribly Christian. Today only I was listening to the Pope who has taken over in his first mass, and I was reading Las Casas. So it was such a coincidence of, that thinking, So this is something which has always puzzled me.
Your concern is our concern too, because the problem that we have is that humanism and humanitarianism, it's born out of colonialism. It's part of the same logic of thought, is that we have to recover people that were put on that position because of colonialism. So when people is not talking about the end of colonialism, they are talking about colonialism in another way, in a humanitarian way, we may say, but it's still colonialism. When Simón Bolívar, or Martí are talking about Las Casas, or in 19th century in general, talking about Las Casas, they are trying to evoke a particular figure. We may say it's a kind of a myth, right? That it's useful in order to fight against Spain during 19th century. But this is not it's not a real Las Casas, it's an appropriated Las Casas. It's the good Las Casas that they want to show or to use as a tool for combat the idea of colonialism during 19th century. So when we are talking about humanitarianism, we are talking about colonialism too. And the idea that the humanities are born during the 16th century itself speaks about the relationship between those two, right?
And Gustavo Gutierrez taught us, he was my colleague at Notre Dame, and he taught us that poverty is not a natural occurrence. It's not that like rain,
Rivers and poor.
Yeah.
No.
Poverty is a historical process. Is a result of historical processes, and thus the response should be historical and material. So we are very much. Gustavo had a deep admiration of Las Casas, but he was mostly thinking about Las Casas from the 50s and 60s, which is fine. We are many. We are legion through our lives. We change, and fortunately we change, and not always for the better, but we are different people at different times in our own histories. And Las Casas obviously was. We want to work in a book about evangelization and the único vocationis model, right, David?
Well, yes, because the final project in the 1520s was Cumaná in Venezuela, and it was a disaster. It was a Pacific colonialism, and it was a disaster. So then he enters the Dominican convent, and he stayed there for 10 years, reflecting about what happened, what happened, how can we solve this, and he ends coming out the convent with the idea, the notion that the project is a pneumopolitic project, not a biopolitic project, but a pneumopolitic project. That is the transformation of cultural life through Catholicism, through the idea of Christ, through the idea of converting the people to the Christian faith. Basically, it's changing from mining communities and agrarian communities to God.
Yes, it's like when Foucault was talking about discipline and punishment, but he went to Brazil and ended up talking about sex. So more or less that happened with Las Casas. He was talking about economy, political economy, taxes, all these things. Entered the convent and came out talking about peaceful evangelization and God.
I think there are several questions in the chat.
Okay, I don't. Can anybody?
No, I don't see any question in the chat. No, there aren't any questions.
Vijay,
I just wanted to add one small. Sorry, Ravi. I just wanted to add to this that I've been reading Miguel Angel Asturias's text where he talks about Las Casas as Don Quixote. He compares. He juxtaposes these two figures. So that's also another kind of mythification of Las Casas, as somebody who had a project which was maybe destined to doom or of the kind. So I think this mythification, which begins in the 19th century, continues till much later. And it's only maybe, if you look at the evolution of Las Casas ideas through his texts at different points of time, that we are able to come to some understanding. Yeah, Ravi, sorry for, yeah.
No. My question basically comes from a very simple point, because
Professor Dr. Ravi Kumar is a professor of sociology from the South Asian University. And yeah, you didn't introduce yourself.
yeah, sorry, I teach
It's
sociology,
okay.
and I teach specifically my interest in the kind of work that I haven't read. I'm not a Hispanicist, so I don't read things in Spanish. But you said something. You said you were taking a risk when you were looking at Foucault and Marx. And my question to you comes from, which is also in a certain sense a methodological question. See, Marx, when the Foucault, when he is talking about subject making, he is very clear that he believes in dispersal and dispersal of power when subject making is happening. Whether you look at his elaborations on three modes of objectification, etc. On the other hand, Marx is not for dispersal. Marx is looking at a system. So why is it? And it's not that Marx is not looking at body. Look at EPM. Look at when he's talking about alienation. Look at working class in England, the housing question. So body does come in all these places. So how do you marry Foucault and Marx? And the risk that you thought of taking, where did it lead you to when you were taking that risk?
Well, marriages are not always happy, right? So this is a conflicted marriage in which we take from Foucault certain Foucault, not all Foucault, not certainly the one that presents us with the notion of anatomopolitica, anatomopolitics, or discipline, and the constitutions of subjects, but the biopolitical Foucault, who is talking about a modern formation of the organization of labor, armies, cities, etc., with a new category, an abstract category called population. Population is the form in which life is addressed by politics. So through that category, population, and the notion of depopulation in the MTLs, we were able to think about what was really at play in this discussion, which was labor. And Foucault himself states that life only becomes important when it's valued, and one of the key elements for the evaluation of life is capitalism, industrial capitalism, and other factors too, like the rise of the modern city and the army, the control of pandemics, etc., etc. So then life has to be taken care because it's a political category, a category from political economy. And that is the way we bridge, or try to bridge, Marx and batería.
Sí, no hay nada que hacer. No tenemos más batería.
Is try to bridge the category of labor with the category of life in biopolitics, labor in Marxism. We don't plan, or we didn't attempt to match all the Foucaultian notion of biopower, which includes discipline and biopolitics, with the notions of alienation and labor in Marx, but just try to explain life in a materialistic term, in an abstract term, and for that we help ourselves with Marx.
Just one thing to add to what Carlos just said is that biopolitics is also a system, and it's also is a system aiming not at the individuals but the population. So it's also a system made by the devices. Control is one device of the biopolitical system. Health, food, disease, control disease. There's different types of devices that make that that biopolitical function as a system. So biopolitics is also a system. Unfortunately, we are running out of battery here.
So if we get caught, but I think we have still a little bit of that.
Yeah, we have a little bit.
So, is there any other comment or question?
Okay.
I think we had planned to have this meeting from 7 to 8:30, and we have overshot the time. But I think the discussion has been so interesting and absorbing that we have not wanted to keep track of the time, and we still have a lot of people here. So I think we can bring this discussion to a close now, and I would like to end by thanking once again Professor Carlos Jáuregui and David Prof for this wonderful exposition on Las Casas early writing and connecting it with the idea of colonial biopolitics and biopolitics of colonial modernity. And thank you so much once again. And on behalf of the association, I'd like to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. We are indebted with you and with all the people of the association, and we would love to keep this conversation going in other opportunities and situations. And we are really humbled by your invitation and by your kindness and by your intellectual engagement. And we thank you from the bottom of our heart for this session, which also help us to think and
rethink so many things. Thank you very much.
Especially because we think that our work has to be pedagogical, always in a book, in a lecture, in every single venue, and that interaction with you help us to reaffirm and confirm that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great night.
I hope to see you soon in various circumstances.
Do come to India, and we can have it in modo presencial.
Oh, we will. You shouldn't say that to a Colombian and an Argentinian, because we'll end up there.
Please do come. Please do come. We would be most happy to host you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.